Next speaker is Professor Antonio Loprieno. He is president of ALLEA, the All-European Academies community, and called ALLEA as mentioned, and he is actually an Egyptologist with interests in linguistics and cultural history, who has published widely on ancient Egyptian language, literature, and religion. He served as the rector of the University of Basel from 2006 to 2015 and the president of the Swiss Rectors Conference. Among many other appointments and positions, he holds the presidency of the Austrian Science Board, a very important board which is also available in Germany. He now combines teaching and research with various functions in science management, such as the president of the Swiss Academy of Sciences and of ALLEA, and he took office for both of these positions this year. So, Professor Loprieno, please start your talk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President of the Estonian Academy of Sciences, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference, which goes into the core of an issue that concerns all academies, and that I would like to look at from an historical point of view. You heard in the very kind introduction that I'm an Egyptologist by training, so I'm interested in ancient history. Well, I promise you we will not go that back in history. That would take us too long. We will also, but just a question that was raised by our colleague is perhaps one that I will try to touch on. That is the mechanisms in which we can make our advice or the science that is produced or the analysis that are yielded by our research, how we can transfer them perhaps in a more cogent way to the public at large. I will start by looking at the Middle Ages and the early modern times. And what I would like to suggest is that when we look at academies, we tend to forget the rooting that the academies had at their origin in actual life, into professional life. Academies were at the beginning, the word academies was basically identical with university. We still keep it in English. The adjective academic refers both to academies in our sense and to academic in the sense of academia, that is universities. And the main faculties to be founded and to produce scholars were the faculties, so-called high faculties, that were concerned with the three main jobs of the elite, and that is religion, law, and medicine. So it was not at all pure research that drove the creation of academies, but rather the impact on society that they could have. And it is just because of this utilitarian perspective, as I would call it, this very close connection that academies had with real life, that in fact they developed a form of eminence, a form of recognition, and a republic of its own that was able to really survive, to have a global appearance regardless of the national boundaries. So there was no national academy in the early modern times the way we understand it, but rather a culturally boundedness of academies within what we now call European values. A major change took place then in the 16th and 17th century. So from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we observed the development of the two models of academy we still observe right now, and that is the academy as learned society on the one hand, and the academy as place of instruction and of proactive advice on the other hand. it's not by chance, if you look at it from the point of view of historical analysis, that in a political tradition such as the Italian one, academies were mostly learned societies. There was no real state that they would serve as advisors to, whereas in France in the 17th century, probably the prototypical example of national state with academic institutions serving the purpose of the state, when the Académie Française was created in the 17th century, that was precisely what its purpose was, to be deeply rooted into the national program of instruction, and thus to be, to a certain extent, a kind of reservoir for the national elite. And that this dichotomy, learned society versus place of formation and of advice, is something that still remains in our DNA, as it were, as academicians. The next major change took place then in the 18th and went on through the 19th century. And this is what I would call the emergence and the triumph of the German model of academy. All academies that we are familiar with are, to a certain extent, also the result of this major change that took place in the history of academias and of academies in general, which is that academies, from being, so to say, spontaneous learning societies with or without an embedment in the state program, became what I would call the owners of the scientific project. That is, they became the institutions in Europe which were the first address for scientific progress and for ownership of science. This is the two examples that I give here. So from the point of view of the buildings, the Academy of Sciences of Berlin, now of Berlin-Brandenburg, and the British Academy are development of models in the wake of this type of creation, which made academies, gave academies a very concrete function in terms of programmatic development for the scientific project. Now, this model pretty much remained unchanged until the next stage. And I would see the next stage in our process and in our trying to understand how academies can provide a role in this ever complex world, is a transformation that has affected the entire European higher education area, beginning with the end of last century. There are many reasons for that. We can look at political reasons, that is the end of the Cold War. We can look at economic reasons, also the development of a new age, what we call the digital age. But generally speaking, we can say that at the end of the 20th century, and even more in the first years of the 21st century, universities all over our continent have gone a profound transformation, whereas academies have not. And in this sense, I think that I anticipate something that I will dwell on a bit more later. It's probably the moment where we as academies have kind of lost track of being in the driver's seat of scientific development, and also of playing a role in societal challenge. Universities from the end of the 90s and beginning of the 20th century have gone, as opposed to earlier forms of European universities, in three areas have undergone major changes. Just to put it in a very general way, in the area of governance, that is, European universities in various forms, pretty much all over the continent, have become what is called autonomous. However, a bizarre type of autonomy in which, on the whole, they remain dependent on state funding. So it's a complex form of autonomy. The second is at the level of organization. Universities in the continental European traditions were very much decentralized structures based on faculties or institutes or seminars, etc. And they have acquired over the last 20 years very much an organizational power, which has emphasized the role of the label of the single university, and we can talk of the emergence of rankings and of the quantification of research that has gone with it. And third, at the level of administration, universities have become structures from which a form of efficiency is expected, because in efficiency, transparency, all these quote-unquote virtues that we sometimes complain about, but that are typical, that come from economic consideration, and they are the result of the fact that universities, of course, used to be completely decentralized entities in the hands of the state, and have been empowered, as it were, with an autonomy that also has the consequence of having to provide a certain administrative efficiency. So these three major changes have affected all our universities, but have not really affected our academic world in the sense of our academic institutions. And so my point would be that, so it would probably be a good idea where if we as European academies would participate in this evolution. So how to do this? Generally speaking, I would like academies to embrace what I call here the agenda of an Enlightenment 2.0. And Enlightenment 2.0 means being aware of the fact that the values of the Enlightenment values that we all carry in our DNA as academies have been somewhat challenged in recent years, and so the President of the Parliament just used the adjective turbulent world, to describe our present situation, and I think it's a very appropriate adjective. So we need to establish a new form of approach to this development. So we should, in my opinion, prioritize institutional over individual concerns, which is precisely what universities have done, in my opinion, effectively, and to look at the societal impact of our work, not only at the impact in a narrow academic crisis, but in society at large. The second point is that we saw at the beginning that one of the features of the early modern academies, medieval and early modern academies, were the fact that they were characterized through eminence. And I think eminence is something that we all as academicians experience and that we cherish. I wonder, however, whether we would not be better served to renounce part of our eminence and to become perhaps more involved in evidence and knowledge-based approach to our society. And what President Kluting said before about the role of science advisors is very much to this point, based not so much because we are so good and we have this tradition, but because we provide concrete answers to specific points. And third, I think that embracing the Enlightenment 2.0 agenda means securing what I call the primate of science in society. I think that we all see around us a certain decadence of the trust in science. Now, I tend to believe that this decay of trust in science is not truly a decay of trust in science, but rather a decay of trust in scientists, because they tend to be associated with quote-unquote elites. Whatever the reason may be, I think that our function is to really see to it that our society is driven and continues to be driven by scientifically based analysis and ideas. And if we want to summarize these three main points that I think qualify academic work, I would describe them with the three adjectives: openness, relevance, and orientation, and let me just say a couple of words for all of these three aspects. Openness. The type of knowledge that we have cherished since the Renaissance, the knowledge based on the printed book, the knowledge in which a professor conveys something that he or she knows, in the past, unfortunately, mostly he knows, to a larger audience of students. This model is a little bit old, because most of the knowledge itself that students now can have access to, they can click it within 3 mouse clicks, and actually the piece of knowledge itself has really lost the ownership of a professor or of a scholar behind it. So what we now go over from the absolute monopoly of the individual knowledge, a book written by an author, to what is now called social knowledge. Who is the author of a Wikipedia article? The community, right? Which also allows forms of correction to this knowledge. This is something, Wikipedia, MOOCs, is something that profoundly changes our approach to knowledge, and that requires a more enthusiastic embracing of open access to knowledge. And here too I refer what the two speakers before me already said. The second point is, for the second point I will refer to a very nice dichotomy that was put forward by the English sociologist David Goddard. And David Goddard wrote an interesting book in which he divides present-day society in anywheres and somewheres. And the anywheres are the people who can basically live in any place. You could say the mobility-prone people, the people who are actually, who can recreate and reestablish their lives or their professional activity pretty much everywhere in the world, where the location doesn't play a role. And somewheres are, on the other hand, people that are still, we could say, very much rooted in one particular place, and that tend to be the losers of these globalized tendencies. Now, my point is that probably we as academies, we are, so to say, the prototypical examples of anywheres, and we would probably in the future need to look a little bit more at the somewheres in our societies, so to try to become closer to the needs of those who, for the wrong reasons, but who have ostensibly lost a certain trust in some of us or in some of what we say. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. And the third is from specialized knowledge to frames of reference. I think the job of the academies, it's not so much at the present time, it's a bit like the job of professors. It's not so much, or not only to produce new knowledge, but in the sense, because probably the very punctual production of new knowledge is now taken care of by research centers or universities, also very well. But what we might be, our unique selling point, as it were, might be that of placing this this knowledge, this very modern knowledge, very punctual knowledge, into a frame of reference. And the frame of reference that provides also the values of science or scholarship, it's not something that you can reach with 3 mouse clicks of your computer, but is something that you can only obtain if you are able to embed your knowledge into a broader context. And that is that which allows you to really put science to the center of your activity. And that would be also my comment to the answer of our colleague before. Right, so how can you see to it, or what can you do in order for our politicians to be sensitive to our advice? Well, try to present it in such a way that it is framed in the proper way, that we also give, let's say, the tableau within which to insert punctual information and not just the information itself, which may also, because of the challenges of the digital age, may not reach the addressee in the way we would all like. So my last point is a summary. No, that's enough. That would be the next. Now, the summary is that I see that in order to meet contemporary challenges, European academic institutions need to do basically two things. One is to become more involved in society at large and to be a little bit less state-centered or politics-centered than we tend to be. Now, you might also think that that you will recognize some Helvetisms in this statement, of a scholar who comes from a country who is not a member of the European Union, but I don't think that has a specific significance. I think it's really a general reading. I think our future is more in society than among politicians. This also means that we might become a little bit more open than we have been in the past to public-private partnerships. So not only, let's not just look at rooting ourselves well among governments and to get our money from the public hand, but perhaps go out of our way and also challenge the private sector and enter in a dialogue with them. The second is that transmitting science is not transmitting punctual knowledge, pieces of knowledge, but is transmitting context of information. So rather focus on the general trends, on what is plausible as opposed to what is implausible, rather than what is right and what is wrong, because we have reached a complexity also of our scientific investigation in which it's not always easy to say this is right and this is wrong. But if we ourselves and we entice our fellow citizens to reading the plausibility of scientific claims within a frame of reference, that may make our job to a certain extent easier than so if we didn't. With this, I now thank you very much and very open to any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Loprieno, for your interesting thoughts about the role of academies in the transmission of science. I'm sure there are questions on this topic. Who would like to start with a question? I think I'll do it by myself. First, the ideas you had just at the end is that we should not only look for funding, let's say, from a government, but also from the private sector. In Germany, we have a discussion on that idea, and some colleagues say that if we depend on the private sector will determine what we should ask, what question we should ask. And therefore, it's also some kind, let's say, of bias, whether it's better to get autonomous due to the financing of the state government or by a private institution.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm of course aware of this criticism, and this is something that we usually, it's a criticism that we frequently hear in our continental tradition, in which academic institutions are basically public. Now, I would like just to tell you this, my impression is that the strings attached with public funding are not less so heavy than the strings potentially attached by any private hand. I think that the private sector, of course, one would always have to look very precisely whether there are no particular expectations which might jeopardize or compromise our neutrality as scientists. But first of all, this is so also the case with government funding. And need I say more in particular countries, which I will not mention right now. So this is certainly an issue now. And second, the idea that the private sector would link a participation or a partnership with particular direct expectation seems to me to be a little bit primitive, because you know the managers of high-tech business, they are not so stupid that they do these things so openly. So they might follow also a very broad agenda, but I wouldn't think that they would dare have a very direct influence. Now, my experience also, you mentioned that I was a rector of a university. My experience in a country that is not known to be dictatorial, but let me tell you, my experience is that the strings attached with money coming from the political hand was not any less relevant than the strings attached by a private business that would organize a chair with you. So I think one needs to keep the eyes open and to be assertive, but I wouldn't be overly concerned.
Mm-hmm. Okay. More questions? Then another point which came up during your talk, you mentioned the words openness, relevance, and orientation. And I completely agree with this set of words, because it's really, I think, the major topic which we as academies should follow in this order even. The problem is still, and you mentioned it, I think at the beginning, that the decay of trust in science in general. You mentioned one country, I can imagine which country you mean, but it's not only, let's say, in this country, but I think it's in Europe the same situation, that even in the political area, you can see that facts do not count anymore. And what process should we start in order to overcome this problem?
Yeah. You know, here I think that there are very many reasons involved. One is the end of, you know, the traditional political divide that we had between center-right and center-left. Is now somewhat the end of this cultural identity enthusiasm that we have for a certain number of years, and of course the digital transformation. So I think this decay of trust, I said it's more in scientists than in science. I think this has to do with the fact that it has become extremely fast to say any type of stupid commentary and to have likes for any type of absurd idea, whereas before the diffusion of this digital, of this social media, it was a bit more complicated, so that there were more filters. So I think it's not so much, this is perhaps I'm an optimist, but I don't think that the real percentage has changed within society. What has happened is that a layer of society that was in our Enlightenment I era completely excluded from statement, that said, well, we don't need to pay attention to what you're saying, now have come to the fore through the diffusion of social media. So the point is, we as scientists, we should become masters also in controlling the diffusion of information and to reestablish what, in my opinion, still remains our primate. I hope so. But I think it's also a question of filters of the digital age, and it's a question of small transformations until we get also access, full access to the control of this technology.
There's still time for one more question. Please go ahead.
Your final points, conclusions, was that instead of providing a set of facts, so-called facts, the scientific community should come up with plausible, contextualized explanations of things. But isn't there a risk that plausibility depends on the gullibility of the listener. And how do you then decide what is a plausible explanation and what is not? We just heard yesterday or the day before yesterday that President Trump considers the Saudi Arabian explanation of what happened plausible.
Right. But you see, this is an excellent question, but I would now try to answer with the same example that you gave. I think the job of scientists is precisely to demonstrate how stupid this conclusion is. Because what is possible, you see, I mean, it was mentioned that I am an Egyptologist. So when I was hundreds of times in my life confronted, especially I must say when I taught in the United States, but I hope no one feels offended here, but confronted with questions by the public, well, but is it impossible that pyramids were built by the Martians? Nope, it's not impossible. Not right, it's not, it's extremely unlikely. But I think to say that it's extremely unlikely is far more persuasive and should convince people far more than to say it's impossible. Because possible and impossible is a digital opposition. And actually, there are very, very few things that are impossible, all right, in a mathematical sense. However, if you train your public to analyzing in an analogical way, then the opposition becomes not any longer possible or impossible, which puts the weight of demonstration too much on the side of the possible, but rather on the 98% that is between the sure and the impossible, which are different levels of analogical probability and plausibility. So my argument would be, try to convince, try to abolish the word possible or impossible and try to enforce plausible or implausible.
Okay, thank you very much for the comment.